Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 in our first lecture where we're going to focus on responding to literature and specifically looking at the fictional elements and Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. So if for some reason you did not read Chopin's Story of an Hour last week, please turn off this lecture now, go and read that short story, and then head on back over here to see the lecture. One way to approach this story is to really think about the fictional elements, and to do so, we are going to enact what is referred to as a very close reading of a story of an hour, where we look at how these elements like plot and character, how they work together to create the short story and to create meaning. So you already know a lot about the fictional elements because you've been studying literature in your classes for a very long time. But I thought I would put up on the screen some of the key elements, what I refer to as sort of a writer's toolbox, right? What they have at their disposal to create a good story, to keep us engaged, to keep us thinking about the story and the characters after we finish reading that last word. So here they are on the screen. We're really going to be focusing on plot, character, setting, conflict, symbolism, irony, style, and point of view. And you already know, when I say character, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But as the semester goes on, we are going to get more in depth to looking at each one of these elements and how they work together. We're going to start with the three basics here: plot, character, and setting. It's really the who, where, and what. And anytime we read a short story, I think our instinct is to begin with these three, because the first time we read a story, we're reading it for comprehension. We want to know what happened and to whom. And it's only after that initial reading, that we start thinking about, well, why? Why did the character do what she did or what he did? And, what are the sort of antagonizing forces that are getting in the way of a character getting what they want or what they desire? So I often like to start by saying, okay, let's start with character. So when we talk about characters, who's the main character? And so we want to get used to this semester using the literary term, who is the protagonist? Now, the protagonist is the character that we care the most about. In other words, the story, the problems, all of the stress, those things are happening to the protagonist, to the main character. In Story of an Hour, clearly that protagonist is Mrs. Mallard. And one way that we know that she is really the prime focus is, we get inside her head. We know what she's thinking. Think about even the way the story is constructed. As soon as she finds out that her husband has been killed in this train accident, she sobs and then she goes upstairs. And notice, as readers, we go upstairs with her. We don't stay below with Josephine or Richard making tea. No, instead we go up those stairs and we sit in front of the window and we look outside. We stay with Mrs. Mallard. And afterwards, after she's been sitting in that chair and she comes to this realization that, oh my God, I want to embrace the sense of this freedom. And so when Josephine comes to her bedroom door and knocks on it and Mrs. Mallard opens it up, we go downstairs with Mrs. Mallard, right? We follow along with her. And so she is our protagonist. Now, when we talk about characters, we can also talk about that there's often an antagonist. So the antagonist is also a character, and this would be the character that the main character is sort of butting up against, is having a problem with. In your own life, right? In your own life, most of you are your own protagonist, right? You're the main character. And sometimes that antagonist could be a little sister, a little brother who gets on your nerves. Or maybe it's your boss at work. Ideally this semester, I hope I'm never your antagonist. But in the Story of an Hour, I want you to really think about this. Who is the antagonist? At first we might think, well, maybe it's Mr. Mallard, right? Because Mr. Mallard he's the one she's married to. She's not happy in her marriage. It feels restrictive. But there's something about pitting Mr. Mallard as this antagonist that doesn't quite fit. because we are told on several occasions that, he's not a bad husband. Even Mrs. Mallard knows that he loves her, right? She says, he never ever looked at her except with love on his face. He seems to be a solid husband. We know he holds a job. They have a house. He looks at her lovingly. And so pitting him as an antagonist doesn't quite sit right. And so we might want to broaden that question to sort of ask ourselves, okay, if he's not the antagonist, is there another character that is, or what might be an antagonist? What is it about their marriage that is so restrictive? There's no indication that he's abusive, that he's cruel, and so there's something else going on, and we're going to try and pick that apart as we talk about it here. There's always supporting characters, these sort of secondary characters. Now, in a short story, right, like story of an hour, we have a very small cast of characters. Really, we only have Josephine, Mrs. Mallard's sister. We have Richard, the family friend. And at the very end, we have the doctors that arrive who make that sort of wonderful, ironic claim that, Mrs. Mallard died of the joy that kills. Certainly, if this was a novel or a full-length play, we would have a lot more characters, and those supporting characters would appear. Some of them would be pretty fleshed out, and some of them, again, would just have very brief, maybe one-liners or two. But in a short story, our cast of characters tend to be really small. But I think when we're talking about protagonists, one of the main questions I want you to always sort of be asking is, what does a character want? What does Mrs. Mallard want? Right? And I think it's pretty clear. She wants to be her own person. She wants to make her own choices. She tells us that she doesn't want to have to bend her wills to another, right? She doesn't want to have to be sort of a secondary or a supporting character her entire life. So the second question that pops up is, okay, so what's getting in the way of that desire to be herself, to be an autonomous character, to be able to make her own choices? Is it really Mr. Mallard? Is he getting in the way? Do we think that he even is aware that she is unhappy or wanting more? So we're really thinking about, if it's not Mr. Mallard that's the antagonist, who might it be? To get clues to that, we want to talk about setting. Setting, this is the where and the when the story takes place. And so let's start with sort of the most basic. Let's think about when the story was written. And so that tells us we're right at the turn of the 20th century. This is the time when most couples, they married for life. Divorces, while they existed, they certainly weren't common. Some women, yes, were going to university at this time period, but that wasn't the norm. In other words, the norm was that a young woman would grow up, she would get married, that marriage would be expected to last forever. Her main occupation would be to be a wife and then, assumingly, a mother down the line. And we know that Mrs. Mallard is young. There's no indication in the story whatsoever that she works outside the home. We do know that they live in a two-story house. It seems to be in town because when she listens out the window, she can hear someone peddling their wares. And there's a term, peddling in wares. We don't really find that phrase very often. But it means that outside her window, there's some kind of commerce going on, right? Somebody's out there and, they're selling ice or they're selling flowers, but something is being sold. And so we know that they're not living off in some kind of remote place, but they're living in town where we can only imagine that there's all kinds of life and energy going on outside that window. So when we also talk about settings, let's think about, okay, so where does it take place? It takes place in some kind of a town, inside of a house, and so you can picture this two-story house. We know that This house during this time period is likely owned by Mr. Mallard because that would have been convention. And so when we think, all right, there's some literal aspects. It's a 2-story house. When you walk in the front door, we know that the first thing you would see would be the stairs. We know that upstairs, when she goes to her bedroom, there's a window and she's sitting in a chair. When the story takes place, okay, it's turn of the century, but we can also think more immediately, when does the story take place? And it turns out it takes place in springtime. And we know that again because when she's sitting in front of the windows, there's reference to the birds are chirping, and there's sort of these blue skies, and all of that is building up this kind of mood. And it's also introducing us to part of the conflict of this particular story. Because when we talk about setting, we're not just talking about the literal where and when, but we're also talking about how this setting is symbolic. So remember that inside the house, right, this house that we can assume that Mr. Mallard owns because of the time period, Mrs. Mallard has just learned of her husband's death, and so the mood inside this house is pretty somber, right? Because we know despite her wanting freedom, she loved him, right? There's that great line sort of in the middle of the story where it says, you know, she loved him most of the time. And she knew that she would cry again when she saw his body, right? Once that body was returned and it's time for the funeral. So it's not as if she hates him or anything like that. But so the mood is somber. It's full of grief inside this house. But when she looks out the window, it's spring. And spring is kind of this conventional symbol that we have not just in literature, but in society. We call it a kind of conventional symbol of new life and hope and rebirth. Again, think about all those sort of the freshness. There's a feeling of, you know, there had been a kind of rain going on before the story took place. And also outside of the window is that story, is that setting of the public, right, the commerce. And it's staring out that window that she starts to have this feeling of, wait a minute, what does this death mean for me? And she realizes that as a widow, she can have her own life, right? So in some ways, this story is taking that saying of till death do us part, kind of literally. She can only have her freedom if Mr. Mallard has died. So at first, when she starts feeling this freedom, she starts to feel guilty, right? I mean, this is her husband. She shouldn't be feeling the sense of, I don't know, excitement about what her new life might be like. But she comes to terms with that, right? At first, she pushes it away, but ultimately, we've got that great sort of moment where she whispers, free, free, free. And we know that she decides to embrace that. And we know it because when her sister knocks on the door and she opens it, she's described as this goddess of victory when she descends those stairs. So here's the problem, though. She's embraced this hope. She's walking down those stairs. She feels as if she has won something. And all of a sudden, right, in walks the door is her husband. And what happens? She drops dead, right? And so she never makes it outside that house, right? She never gets her new life. She never gets out to that world of possibilities of new life. Instead, she dies right there on the literal threshold of her front door. And we can read that as symbolic, right? That she is not able to sort of claim that new life in this public sphere as long as Mr. Mallard is alive, right? So again, coming back to that classic saying, you know, till death do us part. It turns out if he's not dead, she can't have her freedom. The only way she can have her freedom with him alive, well, this becomes the big question of the story. Can she have it only because she herself is dead? How do you want to read the ending of the story? Does she, literally, she dies, right? Does she die of a heart attack? Does she die because she's so overjoyed and excited to see him? That's what the doctors say. She dies of the joy that kills. Or does she die because, man, it would almost be better to die free than to go back to living a life where she feels trapped, right? Once she can identify and know what freedom is, it would probably feel unbearable to go back and live a life that feels like a lie. So it turns out that the setting here, I mean, it's powerful. The fact that she never gets outside that front door tells us a lot about what her particular conflict is. You know, when we talk about plot and we're talking about, okay, what happens in a story, and in many ways I've been kind of summarizing the story as we've been talking about it. But in a really narrow sense, plot is what happens. It means it's the action, right? Just the events. What this happens and this happens and this happens. And I could probably give you a quick 20-second plot summary, right? Where I leave out all of the interpretations. This is just what happens. So here's our exposition, right? This is our background information. So Mrs. Mallard has heart trouble. That is what Chopin thinks we need to know about Mrs. Mallard in order to get into the story. She has some kind of heart trouble and she's just found out that her husband has died. And then we have rising action. Think about rising action as a kind of tension. And so she immediately cries. She goes up to her room to be alone. This is all action. It's what happens. Looking out the window, she sees the spring air. She hears that peddler. She begins to feel this kind of anxiety. And then the climax, right? This is the high point, or it's the aha moment. It's where Mrs. Mallard has to confront head on the problem. And the problem is she's starting to feel this sense of freedom and hope for the future. And she feels guilty about it and she tries to push it away, right? She doesn't want to embrace that freedom initially. And then she ultimately does. And that's where she whispers out the free. Falling action, that's simply everything that happens as a result of her addressing the problem, accepting the freedom. So what happens? She walks down the stairs. She feels like a goddess of victory, right? And then, bam, in walks her husband and she dies. And so this story has a pretty clear resolution, right? There's not going to be a part 2 unless we want to turn this into kind of a ghost story and she comes back from the dead to tell us, you know, what happened next. Not all stories are going to have such a clean resolution at the end of the story. But one of the things I like about Chopin's story is that here it's so condensed. I mean, she packs so much into really, what, a page and a half. And it provides a nice example of this basic plot arc, which most short stories will follow. In fact, even plays will follow this. When we get to talking about Hamlet, the play Hamlet follows the same basic plot arc or narrative arc. You're going to see that all of Act 1 is largely exposition. Act 2, rising action, climax, Act 3, falling action, Act 4, and resolution will be Act 5. And so I want you to remember this particular slide because we will come back to it repeatedly throughout this course. So going back to Mrs. Mallard's problems, when we talk about problems, we're really talking about conflicts, right? There's the literary term we want to use. And in literature, we find 5 key conflicts. And anytime you read something, I think you want to take a look at, you know, what conflicts are going on. When we talk about looking for the climax, right, that moment in a story or a poem or a play where a character really confronts head on the problem, we're talking about what do we see as the primary conflicts. Because as in life, often we are engaged in multiple conflicts, but there's normally one, right? There's sort of one that is the instigating event or argument that then sets everything else off. So let's start with protagonist versus self. This one is pretty common in literature. It's going to keep popping up. And so, is Mrs. Mallard in conflict with herself? And in some ways she is. Certainly when she first gets that inkling of what her husband's death would mean for her, and she's starting to feel kind of excited about it and that wanting this sense of freedom, she does feel guilty about it, right? She tries to push it away. And so, yeah, she's in conflict with herself. And I think the secondary question is, well, why? Is it feeling guilty? Meaning if I look towards the future, am I, it doesn't mean I don't love him? Or is it maybe worrying about what will other people think? Is it just this idea of, well, is it wrong for me to want this kind of autonomy? Certainly society at the time is telling women that, your number one duty and sort of your responsibility is really to hold up your husband and take care of the family. So she is in conflict with herself, but as I've been talking about it, I think you probably see that the reason why she's in conflict with herself is largely because she's in conflict with society, the way marriage, the institution of marriage, is defined at the time period. And in some ways, when we talk about, again, she's not necessarily in conflict with Mr. Mallard. He sounds like a good guy, and she does love him most of the time. I always laugh at the way that's phrased in the story because it might be the best definition of marriage that I know, right? You're in love with someone most of the time. But I think, if this couple were living today, right, and it's the 21st century, chances are they would be in a better position to talk about why is she unhappy, and they probably would have problem solved. Maybe she wants to work outside the home. Maybe she is wanting to go back to school. Maybe she wants to sell the house and they want to go traveling, whatever it might be. And the fact that we're told on several occasions that Mr. Mallard seems to love her as much, my guess is he would have done just about anything. So this is pretty telling. It tells us that during this time period, they probably aren't even talking about the problem. And that's where the very opening of the story comes in, where the exposition comes in. So think about this. We're told in that very first paragraph, right, like 2 sentences long, that Mrs. Mallard suffers from heart problems. What does that mean? This story taking place when it does, when we talk about sort of how would Mrs. Mallard have been diagnosed, right? This is before EKGs. This is before there could have been a stress test. What does that mean to have heart problems? So chances are Mrs. Mallard might have been feeling as if she didn't have a lot of energy. Maybe she was kind of just shuffling through her days, feeling tired. Maybe instead, every once in a while, she would feel this sort of, her heart would start pounding. But the thing is that these symptoms could be symptoms of depression, of anxiety. And so what would have happened, right? Would she have gone to her doctor and said, look, my heart is racing, or I feel like I can't catch my breath sometimes, or I just don't want to get out of bed sometimes. And so the doctor says, well, it must be physical, because at the time period, the thinking would have been, well, what would you have to feel anxious or depressed about, right? You've got this good life, you have a house, you have a good husband, he has a good job. Well, it must be physical. And so that sort of vague term that Mrs. Mallard suffers from heart problems is really pretty clever on Chopin's part, because it does allow for the literal sort of dying of shock when Mr. Mallard walks in the room. But it also suggests, again, that the major conflict here is really between Mrs. Mallard and the society that she lives in, and the way there are very prescribed roles for women at the time. Now, there are other kinds of conflicts as well, right? There's protagonist versus nature. We don't really see that in the story, but it's a sort of a favorite of Hollywood, right? This would be The Perfect Storm. This would be Twister, right? Anytime you have the main character who's going up against a tornado, a flood, an earthquake, a volcano, that sort of external conflict is very popular in movies because it's exciting, right? It's one of those adventure stories. There's also protagonist versus supreme being, and this is when your main character really butts heads up against either God, has a major case of perhaps religious doubt, or it could be the protagonist versus, say, the devil, right? Someone trying to tempt. But going back to Story of an Hour, really the main conflict is probably protagonist versus society. And so the question that comes is, all right, she resolved the conflict with herself and she embraced freedom. She came down those stairs feeling like a goddess of victory, but does she resolve the conflict with society? And this is where we can have very conflicting interpretations of the ending of the story. It could be that at the end of the story, we say, you know what, society won. She never gets outside that front door. She never gets to claim her freedom. She dies from shock, from unhappiness of what her husband still living means for her. Or do we see her in some ways as somewhat heroic? She would rather choose death than go back to living a life prescribed by society that she just can't bear anymore. And so you might say that, you know what, she does resolve that conflict. But I think that's sort of a harsh reading, that the only way she can win against society is to kind of say, you know what, I won't be a part of this society. So again, I think you can make a case for whether or not she resolves that conflict with society either way. And I think that's one of the things about literature is it's not as simple as a math problem where, you know, 5 + 5 is 10. Literature is about having to, you know, in some ways look at all of those small details, to look at the facts, to look at the characters, and have to ultimately stand back and interpret their actions. There are other elements that we find in a short story. We've already talked a little bit about symbolism. Certainly the setting is symbolic, the fact she never gets outside of her husband's home. And we've alluded a little bit to irony, right? So irony is something we will keep coming back to as the semester goes on, because irony is when, you know, something happens or something is said that is contrary to reality. And Story of an Hour has the perfect example of that at the end, when the doctors show up and say, she died of the joy that kills. And I think the doctor is sincere. I think he really believes that she is so overjoyed to see her husband walk in the door that, you know, the shock of it causes her to have a heart attack. But I think as readers, we're not sure that's the reality of the situation. We're not sure that she is truly happy with that. And so lots of great play of irony here. Point of view is simply who's telling the story, and we have an outside narrator. One of the things you're going to notice about the story that we're reading for this week, Cathedral by Carver, is that the point of view is first person, which means that it is the main character who's telling us about the story. So pay attention to how maybe that affects the way you view him and what happens. The fact that, you know, there's sort of more of immediacy when a character is kind of speaking to you, telling the story. We're going to hold off and talk about style in another lecture. I just wanted to get it up on the screen. One last bit about symbolism. When we talk about Mrs. Mallard in the story, her name itself is incredibly symbolic in two ways that are worth talking about, because they tie back to the major conflict. Her last name is Mallard, right? And through most of the story, she is referred to as Mrs. Mallard, meaning she is connected to her marriage, connected to Mr. Mallard. But after she embraces her freedom upstairs in her bedroom, it's at that point that we learn that her first name is Louise. It's as if in that moment of claiming her own identity, she drops the Mallard, her husband's last name, and is just referred to as Louise. Now, the other thing that's symbolic about her name is the term mallard. Interestingly, mallards, right, the duck, mallard duck, the male duck, but ducks mate for life. And that goes back to sort of the time period here, that here is a couple that really have married till death do them part. And again, the only way for them to be separate, right, separate entities, is one of them would have to die. And that just, again, is this idea that Mrs. Mallard is really in conflict with the way society is defining marriage at this particular time point. The last bit of this, when we look at a story, is theme. And I always put an S there, a plural, because I think when we read stories, there's multiple themes. I do not believe that there is a single way to read a story. One way to approach a story or to try and arrive at what you see as a dominant theme is to first ask yourself, okay, what is the subject matter? Is it about marriage? Is it about the desire for personal freedom? Is it a story about guilt, right? Any of the sort of ideas that pop up out of a story, you start there, and then you ask yourself, what is the author's perspective on the institution of marriage at the turn of the century? Or what is Chopin's perspective on, personal freedom? And when we're faced with maybe losing it, when you think about the end of that story. And so coming up with a thematic statement always begins with asking questions, right? What does the story tell me about the time period? What does the story tell me about happiness? What does the story tell me about marriage? What does the story tell me about feeling trapped? And if you can answer those questions, right, you're working your way to figuring out, okay, what do I do with the story? What does it mean? What does it sort of take away? So this week, you're really going to be focusing again on the short story Cathedral. And I want you to kind of look at it from all of these different perspectives, right? Ask yourself again, okay, who's the main character? Who's he in conflict with? What is the setting? Is it significant? Are there sort of key symbols at work? You want to ask yourself if you think that the main character resolves anything at the end. And I think, I always begin with a question of, okay, this main character, a narrator in Cathedral, what does he want, right? And if you can figure out what he wants, that'll lead you to the next set of questions. Okay, what does he want? What's getting in the way of him having what he wants? Or does he get what he wants? Is it another person who's getting in the way of him getting what he wants? Is it something about his environment that's getting in the way of what he wants? And then from there you can move on and, well, okay, does he resolve it? And if so, how? And is that resolution satisfying? Or is there something about it that maybe is disconcerting? So take your time reading Cathedral this week. I suggest that you read it several times. Remember, if you do not have your textbook yet, I have uploaded it. Loud car outside my window. I have uploaded it into Blackboard. So even if you don't have the textbook, I don't want you falling behind.